attachment and the role that attachment plays in our personal relationships. And what we'll do today is sort of summarize some of the many things that we discussed and take your questions, comments, and things of that nature and try to come away with some better sense of how to manage our tendency to be attached in our relationships and understanding the role that it plays in contributing to our own experience of misery and suffering. We said so much. We talked about the fact that this tendency to cling, this tendency to possess people, things, situations, and circumstances is at the root of most of our suffering because, unfortunately, the law of life is that nothing remains the same forever. And things come into being, they durate for a while, and then they dissipate. And that means that we will always be separated from the very things that we cling tightest to. I'm not sure, however, that in spite of these previous 4 sessions, that enough has been said about attachment and its relationship to suffering. You will recall that we all are in fundamentally a state of suffering. This undercurrent of suffering runs through our lives. And attachment is our attempt. Attachment is our effort to somehow to give ourselves some relief from the suffering. We become attached to things in the hope that those things that we're attached to will make us feel a little bit better. That in some shape, form, or fashion, that which we are in possession of will somehow mitigate and dilute our fundamental experience of suffering. So attachment is an activity that we ourselves conduct. We're constantly attaching ourselves to all kinds of things in life with the underlying ambition of somehow giving ourselves some form of relief from our fundamental state of suffering. And we talked about the fact that this attachment has to be replaced with detachment. Detachment, however, is not an act in as much as detachment is a level of understanding that you come to in life. And until you come to this fundamental level of understanding, then a life of wisdom is not possible. So today I want you to consider a few things with me. I want you to try to recognize some of the things that we have been discussed. And remember, when I say recognize, I mean recognize in the true sense of the word, to recognize, to rethink, to re-examine a lot of the things that you have considered to have been a truth, to reconsider even some beliefs that you have. So I want you to try to recognize the truth in a lot of the things that we've said. Attachment and that whole effort to somehow alleviate our fundamental state of suffering, our fundamental state of pain, is to attempt the impossible, because nothing can remain the same, and nor can anything be held forever. So we have to begin in this effort to come to a level of understanding that will enable us to become detached, begins with the realization. And this is the thing you really have to get. You have got to understand, if you intend on living your life wisely, you have got to understand that happiness cannot be achieved. Strange. You cannot achieve happiness. And remember, your whole preoccupation with possessing things, trying to own things, trying to control things, trying to manipulate things, is rooted in your fundamental assumption that happiness can be achieved. It cannot be achieved. What you achieve is temporary pleasure. And the emphasis is that it's temporary. It is temporary, transient, and ultimately evaporates into thin air. It does not last. Because happiness itself is something that cannot be achieved. It's going to take you a little while to get the hang of this, because this is a very different thought that I'm suggesting to you. Because you've been thinking that happiness can be achieved. And now I'm telling you, happiness can not only cannot be achieved, have never been achieved by anyone, ever. Then you must say to yourself, Bhagwan, what are you talking about? You see, stay with me. Happiness cannot be achieved. You cannot become happy. You cannot become happy. Happiness is not the result of any activity that you do. There is no action that you must take to become happy. It is the attempt, the impossible. But you can simply realize that you are happy already. Happiness is already the case. It's like this, and we're going to work with this. And hopefully I have prepared the ground to make this intelligible to you. I've tried to give you all of the necessary background. Because even Pam is saying, wait a minute, Bhagwan, now this is now this is too radical. Yes, I am trying to introduce you to a very radical understanding.
It goes against everything else.
Goes against everything you've been taught, I know. You can only be happy. You can only realize that you're happy already. Happiness is an act of will. You will yourself to be happy. There is no activity other than that required. Happiness, bliss, joy is already your fundamental condition. Now, to appreciate that, you have to understand a few things. For instance, Pam, can you do anything to be female? Is anything required to be female? Is any action necessary to go through to be female? Because female is fundamental. It is your fundamental essence. You need not do anything, but simply realize you're female. And voila, you're there. So is the case with happiness. Most of us have a theology that defines God as the essence of all that exists. Is that not correct? We say so often that God is the only reality, that there is no other reality. Is that right? What is the nature of God? What are the characteristics of God? Besides being omniscient, right? Omnipotent, omnipresent. In the East, there's a term called Sat Chit Ananda. Truth, intelligence, and this is the word we're looking at here, bliss, happiness. If the one of the characteristics of God is that God is itself bliss. In the Bible somewhere, God is described as love. God is love. God is happiness. God is bliss. God is joy. And if you therefore are fundamentally made in the image of God, if you in fact are a drop from the ocean that is called God, then at your deepest core you are already fundamentally happy. You are already fundamentally in a state of bliss because you are always inherent in God. There's no such thing as you being separate from God. And it is the realization of your oneness with God then that forms the basis of authentic happiness. And you need not do anything in terms of action, because that is already the case. I know it sounds strange, and we will have to work with this a little bit. But today we will work with it a little bit. But I wanted you to become acquainted with this new kind of seeing that I am suggesting to you today. And to really begin to understand that happiness cannot be achieved, because that is the activity that is causing your attachment. Your attachment is the result of your activity to become happy, is it not? Your clinging to people, things, situations, circumstances is rooted in the fundamental assumption that you are able to achieve happiness. Whereas happiness can only be realized as already being the case. And the number one problem in this whole thing is your ego. Hence again the necessity of transcending ego. Ego is defined as your sense of being separate from God. Ego is your sense of being separate from God. Is it possible for you to be separate from God? Is that possible in reality, existentially speaking? It's almost like asking, can you be separate from nature? Can you exist outside of nature? Is that possible? It's not possible. Ego is the illusion that you exist separate from God. And therefore, all of our attachments, all of our problems begin with this ego. It's a very different understanding here. We talked about jhana yoga last time a little bit. We talked about how to use this intellect. And so we're doing a little jhana yoga now. Okay? But I want you to begin to try to understand the dilemma that we have all created for ourselves, and why it becomes so difficult to manage our attachment. Oh, look at your faces. It all startled. I scrambled your brains this morning, huh? Yes, I scrambled your brains. Yes, that's okay. Now, remember, this is our last session, so don't be shy, because we're not going to revisit this material for a while until next year. We won't be having any more workshops until after the holiday season. So we want to make sure that you take this homework into your holiday seasons and work very hard on it. But I'm not satisfied that I have really communicated to you the profound nature of what it just said. The beginning of living a wise life starts with learning the first lesson, that happiness cannot be achieved. And that all attempts at achieving happiness will always be temporary, transient, and ultimately it will simply evaporate into thin air, because you cannot become happy. You can be happy, but you cannot become happy. To be happy is simply an act of will and realization that your bliss and joy is already the case. It is your seeking of happiness that gets in the way of your becoming happy. It is the seeking of happiness that interferes with your experience of happiness. And you now need to examine your search, because it has been your searching for happiness that has been the greatest barrier to your experience of happiness. Because fundamentally, you only seek that which you feel disconnected from. Is that right? Right? When we talk about union, we seek union out of a fundamental sense of separation, don't we? You don't try to unite with that which you are already united. You don't seek to become one with that which you are already having the experience of oneness, do you? Right? So between you and your goal of union, there's this gap, isn't it? And this is where all the seeking and searching takes place. But it is this actual seeking and searching for happiness that distracts you from the experience of happiness. Again, Pam, if you are trying to figure out how to be a female and involving yourself in all kind of activities and strategies and yogas and scriptures on trying to study on how to be a female, that whole activity of trying to study how to become a female distracts you from the experience of being a female, which is already the case, isn't it? When these great mystics and sages come and say that you are already a Buddha, you are already a Jesus, you are already a Muhammad or Mahavir or a Kabir, or you are already enlightened, all that is necessary is to realize it. That's the whole meaning of God realization, self-realization. And in that process of self-realization and God realization comes a flood of happiness and bliss. Now I'm giving you a very ultimate kind of teaching. It's a very radical departure from the tradition. It causes you to alter your whole concept of God. Isn't it interesting, those of you who have been working personally on exploring your early recollections have discovered in the process how you carry over a lot of your attitudes and beliefs from childhood into adulthood. One of the most crippling concepts that you carry over from your childhood is your concept of God. Have you thought about it? Fundamentally, your concept of God is a concept you developed when you was a child. Think about it. How do you see God? You see God first as being separate from you. Do you not? Right? Fundamentally, God is separate from you. This is how you saw it. And God is that power, other than yourself, that you have to please in order to get good things in life. God is really like a parent, isn't it? For you and for most of us, our concept of God is nothing but a parent in the sky. Is that right, Khadijah? Right? The great father, the great mother, who, if we please, will give us all the things we want. It is almost an exact replica of the child's relationship to his parents. And you look upon God in the same way as you previously looked upon your parents. And therefore, you practice a kind of conventional morality in the effort to please God, just as you practice a conventional morality in your family of origin to please your parents so that you can get the things that you want. So you wind up still being good little boys and girls in order to please the deity. So the deity will give you the things that you want in life. Now, nothing wrong. I'm not condemning that, but I want you to begin to understand that that is a very infantile and childish concept of God that is a direct carryover from your childhood. Nothing wrong, particularly, but it requires editing. So, and that's some homework for you to do, is to update your concept of God and your relationship to it.
It's
Yes.
so difficult because even though it seems antiquated and it was something that we learned as a child, we see so often even now ministers at their pulpits, I mean, just pushing this rhetoric down the mouths of people. I mean, adults, our parents, our relatives, and so it's something that we find ourselves revisiting.
Yes.
Especially when we get into a situation where we're in a crisis and we find ourselves going back to our old modes of thinking.
Yes.
Our friends and our family, as they support us, they inundate us with these kinds of feelings about God. And I've been on the path as long as I've been on the path. I find myself having to, rethink some of my feelings about God. It really requires really close watch of your intellect and how you're thinking, because you can sometimes just run away with it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
This parental guidance is one of the greatest barriers, you see, to a real mature form of spiritual practice. As long as one's spiritual practice is rooted in this parental guidance, it is bound to be selfish, bound to be useless, and quite frankly, bound to be ineffective. Because parental godism does not match up with reality at all. Now, you're being good and you still get sick and you can't process that. You're being good and you still go bankrupt and you can't process that. You see, you're making every effort to comply with conventional morality and ethics, and still calamity befalls you. And your mind can't process that. Because your parental godism is fundamentally a fiction. It is mythology. It is the stuff that belongs to your childhood. It does not line up with reality. Hence, people are very ambivalent in their relationship to their own model of God that they have carried over from their childhood, simply because it does not mimic reality. It does not fit into reality, into one's day-to-day experience. Atheism, in fact, is simply a final protest of the parental model of God. Nothing more than that. It's not that an atheist has experienced the fact that there's no God. They've not experienced the fact that there's no God. It simply means that they have rejected the concept of parental godism. That's all. Yes, Khadija.
I think we have to give ourselves permission to be unclear. I think that we have to say, just like you said, we got this concept. We grew up in a church and a school. The school was around the church that had the Michelangelo, a copy of that with the old white guy with the finger pointing anywhere in church, up on the ceiling. So from the very beginning, that was this old,
Yes.
grouchy looking man is pointing down.
Long white beard.
Yeah, long white beard.
Yes.
And so you didn't even get to use your imagination. That was him.
Yes.
And as you move out of that and you find that the flow in your mind changes, but I think it's okay. You have to give yourself permission to say it's okay that it's not ironclad in my head yet.
Yes.
Because we have a right to be confused from all these different images.
Of course. It's a matter of recognizing. It's a matter of reconsidering, rethinking the whole proposition. That becomes the first step. And then as you go through that process, you begin to see a lot of different things. And today we're confining that kind of examination as it relates to attachment. It's hard to confine it to this, but we're going to make an attempt. And so that you can really begin to appreciate the power of that statement. Because you have to really understand that happiness cannot be achieved in the sense that you've been thinking. And that requires some serious thinking to get you dizzy. I mean, it's hard for you even, I can see it's hard for you even to get your mind to even get on that track. It just, I can see the strain all over your faces. I can see that conditioning just pulling you back down. But you have to get there. And minimally, this level of understanding is required. Minimally. You have to get to this level of understanding. You must struggle, fight, persist, make every effort to try to understand this, because this is a great understanding. This will liberate you from all attachment. Your attachment, the activity that we call attachment, is nothing but your attempt to achieve happiness, which is an attempt at the impossible. It cannot be done, nor is it necessary to be done. You simply have to realize that happiness is always already the case. Yes. Yes, Khadija.
I think that I'm so happy to hear what you're saying. But I think the fear that we have when we hear this is, so okay, if we're already happy, this presents a big void in our lives, but now what do we do with all that our lives are built around? We're just getting ready to move into 'tis the season
To be jolly.
to be jolly, you know. And
Move into it, nothing wrong.
nothing wrong with it, but
Nothing wrong.
again, you know, it's so good to restructure that we're already jolly, like you're saying.
You're already jolly. But the emphasis is now is that you must realize it. See, you can follow it on the intellectual level. You understand the metaphysics. But the problem is that you can't feel it. And the thing that keeps you from feeling your fundamental oneness with God, and in that fundamental oneness is the experience of bliss and joy and celebration. The problem that keeps you from actually experiencing that emotionally is ego, the sense of being separate. It is this fundamental feeling that you have of being independent and separate from that which exists. And that is the illusion. It's interesting. In a lot of the Eastern philosophies, for those who have studied them, there's always this concept of Maya. And Maya has meant, of course, that the perceived phenomena that surrounds you is fundamentally an illusion. That fundamentally your perception of that which surrounds you is a distortion that is not accurate. Yes, there's something there, but not what you are seeing. It is an illusion. And the interesting thing about Buddhism, for those of you who are familiar with Buddhism, what made Buddhism such a revolutionary phenomenon in Asia and India, what made Buddha ultimately rejected and ran out of India by the Brahmins, was that Buddha introduced a very radical new look at Maya. And Buddha said, no, Maya is not something that pertains to the outer world. Buddha said that you are Maya. This I that you think you are, that's an illusion. You are an illusion, not the world. Interesting. Oh, poor Pam is having a Pam is just going.
Don't pick on me.
I won't pick on you. It's everybody, right? You are an illusion. You are a fiction. You in what way? This I, this sense of self that you feel you are that is separate from that which exists. This feeling that you are separate from that which exists is an illusion. Can you understand that? It is an illusion that you are separate from God. How can you be separate from God? You can no more be separate from God than you can be separate from air, from nature. Your experience that you are a separate entity from God is an illusion that we call ego. And it is out of this illusion that we call ego that all misery emerges. You see the point?
You know, since being in this class, I think I'm now starting to understand what ego is really about. And I can see, because I remember when you first started talking about it, as being the false sense of pride, I couldn't understand why that way of describing the ego was used. But now I see how we, in our ego thinking, ascribe to ourselves qualities that are not really ours, independent of our Creator.
Absolutely.
You know, I'm now starting to see it, but what I'd like to say, Bhagwan, is that even with all, I understand what you're saying, and I'm sure others are, their minds are scrambling too under this information. This is not something I've not heard before, and this is probably not something most of us have not heard, but it's like, even with that understanding, that intellectual understanding of the ego and our feeling separate from our Creator, everything that is in place in this universe fights our understanding that on a spiritual level. I mean, Cal, our administrator, is working 24/7 to see that we don't realize that, and I don't know, it just, and this is not to sound pessimistic, it just seems so difficult. It seems that you would have to almost be raised as a child with this understanding, but as an adult, with this crystallized mind, trying to get some understanding, but constantly dealing with the buffers of society that is trying so hard to keep you from understanding this. It just seems almost an impossible task.
It is really difficult because you see, that is due to the fact that our culture have us stuck in one of the lowest stages of human evolution. The function of culture, and that's only true of this culture. This was not the case always. The very fact that we talk about golden ages, silver ages, copper ages, the very fact that we're talking about ancient Egypt when there was people who were walking around with the same consciousness of a Buddha or a Christ, this was coming. This was the norm. The exception was people like us, you see, who are just stuck in all this kind of ignorance, this deep crippling ignorance. But it is a failure of the culture to move us throughout our evolution as human beings to higher and higher states, you see. You have to remember there are 7 stages through which the human being passes en route to God realization. Right? The first stage is the stage that we call individuation. I'm not going to write them down. Dorothy takes care of all of that. Right? So those of you who want to know the 7 stages, see Dorothy later. But individuation, you see, is the first stage that we're moving through. And the whole meaning of culture is to help us to successfully complete each of these developmental stages. And in the first 7 years of life, the whole task and theme of that first developmental stage is to achieve mastery over this physical body, to individuate. The child has now come out of the womb. It has a system of its own, a body of its own, and it has to now master that body, you see. Learn how to digest food, how to eat, and all these other things that previously was taken care of while in the mother's womb. So the first stage of life, those first 7 years, are set aside for that purpose only. And in an enlightened culture and with enlightened parents, the child will be shown how to really master their body. The- all the way down to feeding themselves. And isn't that pretty much what most of us do as parents in that first developmental stage with our children, isn't it? We teach them what? How to eat, how to walk on their own, how to use their hands, how to use their bodies, how to tie their shoes, how to wash themselves up. We individuate them, don't we? Right? And if that process is incomplete, then the child will not learn how to fully operate the body. You see? So that's the first developmental stage. That is the physical stage. Okay? Mastery of just our physical dimension. The second developmental stage is the stage that we call socialization. It is in this stage now that our emotions start developing. We start actually having feelings about how others treat us. And we become aware of how that other people have feelings about how we treat them. And hence, now we need to learn how to negotiate, how to interact with other human beings, right? Things of that nature. And again, that becomes the aim and objective in that stage. That is the psychophysical stage of development, isn't it? It is the stage now where we are also learning how to master our psychology. We're becoming aware of our personal psychologies and the psychologies of others too. And so there's that whole socialization process that is going on now, you see. And the child in that second stage must be taught how to respect others' feelings and so many other things, you see. And when there has been a failure to cultivate a child, a human being, through that second stage, then that human being gets stuck. They start fundamentally having the feeling of being rejected by others. They start having problems with their own relationship with themselves. They start having that whole experience of self-contempt that we talk so much about, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They don't know how to interact very well with other human beings. You see, the socialization process. The child has to be prepared. The human being has to be prepared to live with other human beings. The next stage of development, you see, now we begin to move toward the psycho-spiritual stage. This is the stage of integration, right? The third stage is where the mind enters into the picture, right? Intellect is born. The mental faculties open up. And we have to learn and be shown how to use our minds, how to use our mental energy, how to use our mental faculty, how to think. One of the great tragedy in our culture is that we're never taught how to think. Now you've been thinking that we're overly intellectual and all this too, but intellectualism and thinking are entirely two different phenomena. Two different processes. So in the third developmental stage, the human being has to be helped to gain mastery over the mental dimension. Hence the psycho-spiritual stage of development. Right? And of course, failure to be properly cultivated at that stage of development results in faulty thinking. You limit it to one side of your brain. You can't do, whole hemispheres thinking. And I mean, you can't do any of that kind of stuff. You have no capacity for cosmologics. You see, you can just think logically, linearly, but that's about it. You don't know how to think across the bridge of the brains, none of that. This was not always the case. I want you to bear this in mind. You see, after we have passed through this stage of socialization and we have developed those skills, then the next rung of the ladder and the growth of the human being is to move now into the spiritual growth cycle. Spiritualization becomes the fourth stage, right? And in this fourth stage now, we discover the soul, the spirit, and all these other things. Yoga, meditation, religion, All of these things now are the things that we have to learn about and how to use. We have to discover our spiritual faculties. For instance, beauty, love, all of these faculties that enable us to have these experiences have got to be developed. You see, opened, right? Made to fully function in the human being. You see? It's a lot more about each of these. I'm just giving you a rough outline, sort of like a map, if you will, of our developmental stages as spiritual beings.
I feel like I got a long way to go.
Are you stuck somewhere?
Listen to you, Bhagwan.
Yes. Our ancient African ancestors talked about these same things. They called the first stage of individuation, that was the stage called Kat, the physical developmental stage. The next stage they called the Kaibit, then the Sahu, right? You're familiar with all of that. Then the Ib, right? The spiritual. What they call the Ku, right, is the fifth developmental stage. This is the spiritual transcendent, because it's in this stage that you start learning how to transcend ego. Up until all of these other stages, ego is still there. It is in the fifth developmental stage, the spiritual transcendental stage, that you start for the first time developing the capacity to transcend your ego, which is this sense of separateness. You begin to start reintegrating back with your body. You see? You for so many years you live split off from your body. Then once that entity has been added back to your fundamental being, then you begin to feel your environment again and begin to see your oneness with your environment. You see? With nature. As we feel no oneness with nature. Even nature feels separate from you. You do not realize that the same life that informs that tree, that same life that flows through that bird, is identical to the life that flows through you. It is but one life force, period. And we all inhere in this single, seamless web of life. Life is one. And so as you transcend this egotism, this sense of separation from the web of life, the oneness of life, you begin to re-identify with all life in all of its multifarious forms. And remember, it is the capacity to identify that actually creates the ability to have the experience of love. Love fundamentally is an experience of identification with that which appears to be the other. So much so that the other and you merge into one. Is that right? And the typical marriage vow, that was the whole meaning. This ring joins you now. Is man and wife. You are one being. Most of us didn't get that at the wedding ceremony. We left the wedding ceremony still feeling, okay, I'm still who I am, you still who you are, and life goes on. But it was not that spiritual experience of the merger of the two into one. Because they were a long way away from this spiritual transcendental state of development. You see. Then you move into the sixth developmental stage, which is transcendental. Here, there is a complete capacity now to transcend ego, meaning to completely shed the feeling of separateness from that which exists. Your identity is no longer isolated, separate, independent. In a room, we see a lot of people here. In the transcendental state of consciousness, you see one being in here manifest in different forms. There's not the experience of the many. the experience of the many drops out. There's only the experience of the one. You see the same one entity, just reflected, manifest differently. It's a very different thing, you see. And that's not just in the realm of human beings, you see it in the whole realm of nature. You make no distinction between a flower and a human. It's the same life. You see the life. You see the oneness. And you only have the experience of one union. But there's still just a little bit of ego there. You can hardly tell if you don't look closely. Because it's still, you are having the experience of oneness. There's still subtlety to it. And the seventh developmental stage, you drop out altogether. Or let me put it like this, the other drops out altogether. And everything you experience as yourself. You literally become God. Everything is a reflection of it. It's a very tremendous experience. So you see, Pam, that these are the possibilities available to you just by virtue of being a human being. This is your potentiality. Now, the reality, folks, is that seventh stage reality is already the case. It has to be realized. You see, I've talked to you in terms of developmental stage, but that itself is an illusion. You see, these are degrees of realization. I want you to understand that. These are degrees of realization.
Okay, Bhagwan, if these are degrees of realization for someone who's on the path, who's feeling like I'm feeling like, wow, I got so much to work on. Yeah. Will it happen in this lifetime? Will it happen in a couple of lifetimes down the road?
It can happen in this life. It's up to you. It's up to you.
So is it, okay, this is my question. Does the shift happen independently of another, and the other meaning a guru or an enlightened person? Would the enlightened person be the one that would help the individual to move toward this realization, or does it happen
If you can accelerate the evolution process by keeping the company of a guru, that is the whole point. You see, the company of the guru is important not because of the level of instruction that you receive. The guru relates to the disciple on three levels. The least effective level in the relationship of guru-disciple is at the level of instructions. Because instructions is just a head trip. Very little transformation occurs, you see? But it's all right, because first you have to have a good ideal of where you're trying to go to understand all these metaphysics. So it has its place, don't misunderstand me. But of the three levels that the guru and disciple interact with each other, at the level of instruction, it's the least effective. It's still peripheral to the transformation. Let me put it like that. The next level of relationship between the guru and the disciple is at the level of example. The guru life becomes an example for you to model, to see. You see? Because that enables you to mimic. Because most of your learning at these lower developmental stages is based on mimicry. You see? And so we are able to see an example of what it's like to be a higher realized being, right? How did that being function? How did that being interact? And we can start getting in sync with that. You see, we can begin to mimic that to some extent, not to go too far, but it gives us a little bit more substance than just verbal instructions. But the real benefit of the company of a guru is in what the guru transmits from the guru's actual presence. So this experience of realization is a transmission, if you will. See, we are always transmitting our experiences, all of us, right? And so the guru actually transmit the experience to the disciple in a wordless fashion. This is not a language going on. This is no communication going on. It's going on at a much deeper level of your being. And slowly, that guru's transmission enables you to get involved in that process of awakening. It's like that.
So you said it's not so much what you do, it's what you realize.
It's what you realize. It is realization. All doing is aimed toward producing a certain in-depth increase in realization. So you enter into the realization process, let me put it like that, in the Guru's company. It's what they call satsang. Satsang means association with sat, that which is true. You know, to come into association with that. Because when you come into association with anything, something like osmosis takes place, right? There's a kind of spiritual osmosis that takes place in the company of the Guru. Slowly, you start getting in sync. You start taking it on. It's very unconscious. You know, it's very unconscious. And that is what slowly starts, you know, evolving, pulling you into deeper and deeper level. That's why, Pam, they have said so often in the classic literature that the company of a guru is indispensable. Nothing can happen. Nothing can happen. Because you can go on getting instructions from books for the end of to the end of your life, but there is no transmission going on. You see? There's no transmission. Yes, Katish?
I also feel that, I think I'm relating to what Pam is saying, but I feel very good about this because our culture, I think, maybe it hasn't failed. It's succeeding at its purpose. And it says in the Constitution, the pursuit of happiness. And our culture is a business. And the business of that particular culture is to keep us busy pursuing and buying happiness.
Absolutely.
And if without that, they could not have, if we had come here realizing what you were saying to us, it's too
the
simple.
economy will collapse.
Yes. You couldn't convince people to steal the land from people. You couldn't have convinced them to do all the things that have been done. And so we're trying to struggle against a giant, what you're saying to us, but yet it isn't a struggle.
Right.
And it's almost too simple.
It is very simple. See, that's the problem. The path is so simple, but your mind is so complicated that it can't understand anything simple. Yes, Eva?
When you first mentioned that about happiness cannot be achieved, mentally you start rebelling. I looked at you, pulled my glasses down, said, what is this man talking about now? But as I relaxed, a voice deep within me saying, yes, yes, yes. It fits, it feels good. And it's not, if you just let go and stop fighting it, it's very natural.
It's a very natural thing. In the East, we have called it Sahaj. Sahaj Yoga. Easy. Sahaj means easy. It means natural. This is a very natural state. It's a very natural state. And you had a little glimpse of it in your first developmental stages, the joys of your so-called childhood. It was just natural. Effortless. It was already the case. Nothing had to be done. Nothing had to be achieved. You just participated. The only requirement on your part is just participate. It's here. Everything that you possibly could conceive of is already the case. You have to do nothing but eat. The whole meal lays before you. It's quite a thing. But under the illusion that you are separate and independent from that, then the feeling starts coming in you that I got to do something to get myself this, right? Then that I starts feeling to be wholly responsible for its well-being. Right? Now, I got to carry myself. You're no longer riding, you see, on the current. Maharaji used to always give the example of the peasant on the train who, for the first time riding the train, not realizing the protocol for train riding, would sit with his luggage on his head, right? And he was so uncomfortable. He's sitting there, the train is bouncing up and down, he's sweating, his neck is straining, so uncomfortable. And then one of the other passengers looked over and finally deduced, well, this must be this man's first time on a train. And he said, brother, he says, why are you carrying your luggages on your head? He said, these my luggages. I got to carry them because, you know, these are mine, and I got to get them to the next town where I'm going, and I don't want to lose them. And then the gentleman said to him, but brother, he said, the train is carrying you. It can carry your luggage. Sit it down. And that is what the master telling us, sit your stuff down. Life is carrying you. For what are you carrying all your attachment and burdens and baggages on your head for? You see? It's just that you don't realize. It's all about levels of realization. Realization. And how do you increase your level of realization? Right? What is the process by which we elevate our levels of realization? It is through the process of observation, how we use our attention. Pay more attention. Pay attention. What in Zen Buddhism they call mindfulness. Become more mindful. Watch. Pay attention to life. You see? And the more you pay attention, the more awareness, the more realization. That is the relationship to develop. Become more aware. And you will realize more. And as you realize more, that will move you. That will evolve you. And so in the company, Pam, of the Guru, your process of evolution gets accelerated. But you will get there anyway. But it would take eons and eons, almost an amount of time that we can't even calculate. But you will get there. Because the whole universe is moving there. You have no option. But if you would like to accelerate it, then you keep the company.
Is the guru aware that they are transmitting, or is it the guru is being used as a vehicle outside? You understand what I'm saying?
No, the guru is very aware of the transmission. Because the guru is usually, there's gurus at each level, first of all, aren't there? Right? So it depends on what level. When we start talking about gurus from 5th level up, you know, then it is a conscious awareness of being a vehicle. Gurus 5th level and below are vehicles, but they're not conscious of it. They're just involved in the same struggle. But at the 5th level, the guru becomes very conscious. In fact, the guru in the literature of the East, there's really no distinction made between guru and deity. So because so much of the guru's identity is gone. You see, it ain't guru, this person, that person. It's just God functioning through a human body. It's a very strange thing, you see. In the East, in the West, we don't really have that tradition. But in the East, there's a great tradition of adoration for the guru. It almost looks ugly to us when we see it for the first time. Just bowing and touching the feet. And it looks so subservient. We recoil from that because it looks so out of place. But that's only because we don't have a tradition here in the West, you see. But in the East and in other non-Western countries, the respect for the guru is immense because they have the historical context that informs the true status of the guru, as opposed to the West, you see. I mean, but we don't recall at all when we see a billionaire and we touch that billionaire's feet. That's appropriate in the West, you see. That's very appropriate, right? So it's just that kind of a difference, you see. So it begins again with trying to understand, and I therefore repeat what was said earlier, because I want to drum it in today, if I failed to drum it in the prior sessions, that a life of wisdom begins with the learning of the lesson that happiness cannot be achieved, and that whatever happiness you do achieve will always be temporary, transient, and ultimately will simply disappear in thin air. That you cannot become happy, you can simply be happy. And that is an act of will. Will yourself into happiness. And that the greatest barrier toward this experience of happiness, which is already the case, is the result of the striving that we do out of this sense of separation from our object. This sense of separation is what is technically referred to as ego. And when you're able to transcend that ego, then attachment ends. There is no more attachment. There's no point. Why are you going to be trying to gather things to experience happiness when happiness is already the case? There's nothing in you that drives you toward relating to things and people with the intent and purpose of exploiting them for happiness' sake. Your whole life moves to quite the opposite. You become a contributor. You are off the useless side of life. Now you contribute. Your whole relationship is one of contribution, transmission of your own innate experience of happiness. You see? It's a very, very different thing. Tony, wake up back there. Are you awake? I haven't heard anything from Shanae Budge or Khadijah. See if she's still in the body. Are you still in your body
still
back
here,
there?
I'm writing
Yes. So what we will do is process this a little bit more. Let us take our break now. Alfredo, do you have to work on something here? You need to make some noise. Let's let Alfredo make his noise, and then we'll come back at 10 minutes to 2.